Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for being here with us today. My name is Katie Earle. I'm the coordinator of the University Express program. And we're all joined here virtually with Len Lenihan, and so appreciative of his time for this super timely topic. Before we jump into his presentation, we'll do some housekeeping things as usual. Let you know that we are recording this presentation, and I will try to post it on our website at a later date. Next thing, since we have some new folks here today, I'm sure you've already realized that you've joined muted and without a video of yourself showing, and that's the settings for the program. You have done nothing wrong. And also, you may think you're the only person here in attendance with us, but I promise you there are other people. We're just in an anonymous participation mode, so only Len and I can see everyone who's in here. So we'll be communicating with you using our Q&A panel. So during Len's presentations, if you have any questions or comments, go ahead and type those right in, send them to me, and then we'll try to get to as many as we can at the end of his presentation and that we have time for. And how you access your Q&A panel. So if you join from a computer, chances are that popped up on the right-hand side of your screen. You may just have to expand the panel. You'll see the text box and click send, or else it's just going to be hanging out there. So send that to me. If you don't see that panel, if you look at the bottom right-hand side of your WebEx screen, you'll see a little half circle with a square with a question mark in it. That's your Q&A panel. And last but not least, if you joined us from a smartphone or a tablet, poke or touch your screen. That'll bring up your control panel, and then you'll see the circle with 3 dots, and that's how you access it. So again, we hope you participate, and we'll have some good discussion at the end here today. So I'd like to thank the sponsors of our program. It's my Department of Senior Services, Blue Cross Blue Shield of Western New York, Excelsior Orthopedics, and Wegmans for everything they do to help make this program possible. And also Senior Services, we're here for you. Any questions about program services, benefits, no question is too small. For yourself or a loved one, we're at 858-8526. Now let's learn about our speaker. Len Lenihan is former chairman of the Erie County Legislature, where he served for 20 years representing the Tonawondas and parts of the University District in North Buffalo. He also served as chairman of the Erie County Democratic Committee for 10 years from 2002 and 2012. He also served as Commissioner of Elections for Erie County for an interim period of approximately 2.5 years. From 1996 to 2002, he served as Commissioner of Personnel for Erie County Government, and he served as a delegate to the 2004 Democratic National Convention. And also in December of that year was an elector to the 2004 Electoral College from New York State. He has a master's degree in public administration from the Graduate School of Public Affairs at SUNY Albany and a bachelor's degree in social science from Northwest Missouri State University. And we're so happy to have him here with us today. Len, it's all yours.
Thank you, Katie. And welcome, everybody. I guess I'll say welcome to election week or election season as it is now. With the new way we do our voting, we have almost 1/3 of Americans have voted already. So this is kind of an exciting week and an exciting period in our lives. So let me just say, obviously, Katie pointed out my background, my career. I've obviously been identified with the Democratic Party my whole life. I've attended my first political rally in 1960 when John F. Kennedy came to Buffalo. I was 11 years old, going to Kenmore Junior High in Western New York, and I saw, just an amazing presentation and a very exciting experience with John F. Kennedy. So I've been really involved and interested in public service since then. That being said, our purpose today, when I first wrote the this course description last spring before the COVID outbreak, when we were going to do this in person, I said the purpose of this class today is not to persuade you to who to vote for or even to predict who's going to win, but just simply to go over the obstacles and what the issues are going to be and what it's going to take for either Joe Biden or Donald Trump to win this election. So that being said, let me say this. I also wrote in the course description last spring before COVID that I thought, as is the case in almost every presidential election, that many startling and unpredictable events will occur during the course of this year that we could really not have imagined back when it started. That being said, I could never have predicted what actually came. Obviously, we've been involved in a nationwide pandemic, very heartbreaking, and so much distress and so many people have been affected. Obviously, we've lost over 225,000 American lives. We have pandemic restrictions affecting school, work, home life. Almost every aspect of our life is in some way involves the pandemic. On top of that, unfortunately, so many people have lost their lives due to the shutdown of the economy, lost their jobs, I should say. And then on top of all of this, over Memorial Day weekend, we had the tragic death of George Floyd in Minneapolis, which really began a nationwide racial reckoning, and with protests and, again, a lot of distress in the country. So this campaign is being carried on during extraordinary circumstances and unprecedented times. We thought 2016 was an unprecedented election due to the arrival of Donald Trump on the scene. Everybody thought that Hillary Clinton was going to win, and of course he didn't. But even this year is really something none of us could have imagined. So another thing I said last year during putting this course together, I said that we have a very polarized electorate going into 2020, and that this year's election will look somewhat like 2016, where we just have this very polarized electorate. And so we're going to just start today by talking a little bit about that. Basically, what we've had, the political scientists have come up with a term for political polarization, and it's called negative partisanship. And I saw a good description by one of them who was describing it, and he said, over the past few decades, American politics has become like a bitter sports rivalry in which the parties hang together mainly out of sheer hatred of the other team, sort of like the Bills and the Patriots, I guess, rather than a shared sense of purpose. So just to take a look at the graph I've got up on the screen, in 1976, 20 states were decided by 5 votes or by 5 percentage points or less. In other words, 20 states were competitive, 20 states were in play, and the candidates had to go to all those states to try to win those votes. By 2000, 24 years later, there were just 12 states that were divided or decided by 5 points or less. Again, where those states were competitive and the candidates had to compete. But by 2012, we were down to 4 states. 4 states decided by 5 votes or less. So again, we're seeing, fewer states in play, polarization. Democrats are in their corner, Republicans are in theirs. So 40 states have voted for the same party in each presidential election since 2000. In other words, 40 states have voted right down the line, either Republican or Democrat, since 2000. And in 1916, there were only really 7 states that were considered competitive or up for grabs. So, so today we're going to talk a little about how did we get here. Before we dig into 2020, let's just talk about a little bit, how do we get into this polarized environment? Now, obviously, a lot of this has been commercialized. We now have, I would say over the last 25, 30 years, we've had this phenomena of talk radio. We now have over 1,100 commercial radio stations that are on sometimes 24/7 with, basically putting out, in this case, entirely right-wing rhetoric that is in our political environment. 1,100 stations. We also have now, certainly Fox News and now CNN are all considered our commercial stations that have been joined not only to compete for business, but have become political. So on any of those 3 stations, you can tune in and probably get a really clear sense of the divisions and the polarization in the country. Then on top of that, we sort of matched all that with Facebook and Twitter and political websites and blogs on the left and the right, which have become very hotbeds of political warfare. So all of this, and I'm not saying this is the only reason, but due to the, let me just get my next, panel up here. Basically, politics and political combat has been commercialized. And so anytime there's a commercial operation, the motive is profit. But in order to be successful, it also has to be entertaining. So I read a book last spring about talk radio. And the main, even though there's 1,100 stations basically on the right of our political dialogue, but basically those stations, in order to keep their viewers, have to be entertaining. And that is why you see so much of the, I would say, heightened or hot political rhetoric. Rush Limbaugh is a great example. When he talks about women involved in politics, he talks about feminazis to make it, exciting for some of the viewers. And so political combat has been weaponized by the commercial stations to really inflame passions, mischaracterize things, and also oftentimes to distort and provide, which is also always, or many times, misinformation. So my purpose of bringing this up today is not to blame one side or the other, but it's just to acknowledge that in 2020, and we have for some time, we have had a lot of poison in our political system. And so that's the environment we find ourselves in as we go into the 2020 election. So now to fully understand 2020, we have to go back to 2016 and look at what happened in that, what was called a very unprecedented election, a huge upset. Donald Trump beats Hillary Clinton. So as you can see at the top of the screen on the map, Hillary Clinton got 232 electoral votes. Trump got 306. And remember when I talked earlier about the 40 states that have voted the same way for the last 5 elections since 2000? Well, all of that sort of got shattered in 2016. And it got shattered because just 3 states voted differently than they had voted in the last 20 years. And those are Wisconsin, that has 10 electoral votes, Michigan, that has 16 electoral votes, and Pennsylvania. And so Donald Trump carried all 3 of those states for a total of 46 electoral votes. So if you added those 46 onto Clinton, as many people predicted she would win those states, she would have been obviously elected, she would have been elected president. So my main point for today, and we'll talk a lot about the other factors, is my feeling is the road to the White House in 2020 goes through Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Now, Biden has to win all 3 of those states to win the presidency. Trump could lose actually 2 of those states and still win. That is, if he holds on to all the other states that he already has. So Donald, and a little bit later, we're going to talk about what the state of play is in some of those states that he won last time. So we're going to now move on to the next graph here, and just talk a little bit about, before we get to 220, talk about the demographics and how people voted in 2020 along demographic lines. We can see at the top of the screen here, about 48% of the vote, that means the group, 48% of the voters were men, and they voted for Trump, 52 to 41 by a solid 11% margin. However, when you go to women, and that was 52% of the vote in 2016, Clinton carried those voters 54% to 41. So the men and women were on different teams, basically. But here's a key demographic. Amongst white voters in 2016, 70% of the electorate were white. And among those voters, Trump carried those resoundingly, 57 to 37. He had a 20-point lead amongst men in that election. And we're going to come back to these figures later on. But just to give you an idea of what the 2016 electorate looked like. Amongst African Americans, Clinton, of course, it's only 12% of the population, but she she won that resoundingly. And she won that by 81 percentage points. The Hispanics, I don't know what happened here with my graph. I'm going to turn this up a bit. There we go. We're back.
It got a little, oh, perfect.
That's okay. So among Hispanics, Clinton was a clear winner there, winning by almost 30 points. Asian voters, about the same. Let me go back to my demographic. Some of this map gets a little. So let's look at some other demographics. Among the different age groups, again, people 18 to 29, younger voters voted for Clinton by over 19 points, 55 to 36. Younger voters, again, 30 to 44. Clinton carried them 51 to 41, a 10-point difference. Now we get into the older voters, 45 to 64. Clinton carried Trump carried that 52 to 44. So we won that age group by 8 points. And then 65 and over, the bottom line is that Trump won that group by 52 to 45 by 7 points. Now keep in mind, younger voters, in this case, there was about 44% favored Clinton, but the larger, bigger turnout group, 45 to 64, 65 and over, that counted for about 56% of the vote. They supported Trump. So I want to go to one more graph to discuss one other important point. Obviously, among Democrats, as we know, we've got a polarized electorate. 89% of all the Democrats voted for Clinton, 8% for Trump. Republican voters, just reverse it. 8% voted for Clinton, 88% Trump. What's interesting here, what was a key factor in this election were independent voters. About almost a third of our electorate identify, even though they may be registered Republican or Democrat, about a third of our electorate identify as independent voters. And amongst that group, Trump carried that by 4 points. And that was very significant because that was a big reason he carried Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. So now we're going to go into 2020 in the battlegrounds. And it's 4 years later. A lot of things have changed. Demographics have changed. We're going to talk about that later. But let's take a look at the fight for 2020. And we have a map here that has, some of the red states, some of the blue states, some of the states are competitive. But the bottom line for this election is if Joe Biden carries all the states that Hillary Clinton carried in 2016, he still has to win those 3 states, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, to give him the 46 electoral votes to put him to about 278. Donald Trump only has to carry really one of those states, but here's a big if. That's if he carries all the other states that he carried in 2016. And a lot of those states are competitive right now. Just on the left side of your screen, you can see Arizona, Florida, North Carolina, Georgia, and even Texas. Georgia and Texas were not even considered to be close this time, but in fact, there's battlegrounds going on there. So just to stay on the 2020 map for a second, Biden could lose, for instance, he could lose like Wisconsin and their 10 votes, but he would have to pick up, say, Arizona, where he's ahead right now but only by like 3 points. Arizona is very competitive, but if he was to lose Wisconsin, he would have to pick up a state to replace that with the same number of votes, and that's Arizona. Now, my feeling is the tipping point state this year is Pennsylvania, because they've got 20 electoral votes. And if Biden was to lose Pennsylvania, he would have to replace that with another large state. He could get by with North Carolina with their 15 votes and still get over the top, or he would have to go to Georgia or Texas. Now, let's just talk about Florida for a second. Florida, obviously, matter of fact, Democrats joke about Florida as, that's where Democratic candidates go to die. In other words, it's always very close, but Florida usually winds up going with the Republicans. And 4 years ago, Florida by just about one percentage point. Now this year, Biden is actually is leading in Biden is leading by 2 points as of yesterday in Florida. If he was to carry Florida, and by the way, what's significant about Florida is we're going to know the results of Florida by 9 or 10 o'clock election night. Some of these other states that I've talked about, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, they can count votes, at least in Pennsylvania, Michigan, after the election, as long as the votes are postmarked before the election. In Florida, they count all the absentees as they come in, and they announce the results of those absentees when they announce the results of the in-person voters. So if Florida was to go to Trump, he basically keeps another state that he won 4 years ago, which he has to do. If Biden carries Florida, that really shakes things up for Trump and really puts Biden in a strong position. Keep in mind, 4 years ago, the states that went early for Trump were Florida and North Carolina. And right now, as we speak, Biden is ahead in both those states, but very close. As a Democrat who is, we tend to be a little pessimistic when we're looking at where we can win, where we may not win. Again, my point in all of this is that Biden's best chance of what happened here? I got to go back to where we were before. Hold on. Okay, Biden's best chance of being successful, even though he's ahead in all the polls right now, though those are national polls. The only polls that really count are the state polls. And we're going to look at the polls in a second. But his best bet is to take back Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Why? Because those are the states that were part of the blue wall for 20 years, part of those 40 states that always voted the same way. Trump was able to do that. And by the way, I should mention, Trump won those 3 states combined by a total of 77,000 votes. So he carried Michigan by only 10,000 votes. Wisconsin was a little better than 20,000. He carried Pennsylvania by about 44,000 votes. So keep in mind, to put this in perspective, the 2020 or the 2016 election was decided by a total of 77,000 votes out of 136 million that were cast. So we had 136 million voters in 2016. Trump was able to win because he carried those 3 states. He broke down the blue wall and was able to carry PA, Michigan, and Wisconsin by a total of 77,000 votes. A very, very slight margin indeed. So now I want to go back. We're going to move ahead. And let's talk a little bit about the issues. By the way, at the end of this presentation, I want to leave enough time for questions, comments, what have you. Katie said, even if we run over a little bit, I'm going to try to get it all in within an hour and leave you 15 minutes of that hour to ask questions. But if we run a little bit over, you'll get an opportunity to ask questions or even challenge some of the things I'm saying or whatever you'd like to do. But as we go into the election next week, there's been 3 issues that really have dominated the discussion. Obviously, the economy is always the #1 issue in any presidential election. And I'm just going to take a sip of tea here for a second. Right now, the Republicans have a 13-point advantage over the Democrats as to who can better handle the economy. So that's, advantage Trump. But then we get into the coronavirus pandemic, and all the polls show Democrats have about an 18-point advantage over Republicans. In other words, right now, about 59% of the public does not approve of the job that Trump is doing in fighting the virus. So that obviously looms as a huge issue that Trump really wasn't planning on having to deal with going into last March. He was pretty much focused on the economy, and that was actually good news for him. The third issue that is registering as most important amongst the greatest number of voters is healthcare. And that issue really comes down to the issue of pre-existing conditions. Because as we all know, Obamacare, although it was basically a program that provided healthcare options for people who didn't have insurance, people who are poor, low income, But the legislation itself mandated that healthcare companies in the United States protect pre-existing conditions. And that is a huge issue. I guess, now we've got the pandemic, but I guess there's about 135,000 Americans have pre-existing conditions. And if they don't have, if the insurance companies don't cover them for that, that could break them financially. So Democrats have about an 18-point advantage over the Republicans on the two issues related to health, the coronavirus and the healthcare issue. And really, basically, it's about pre-existing conditions, the protection of that insurance so people can survive an illness, be it COVID or heart cancer, whatever it may be. So another issue that pollsters track when they're looking at an election is what they call right track, wrong track. So again, this breaks down between Trump and Biden supporters. Trump's about 50% of the public say that they are personally better off than they were 4 years ago. That's half the country. But 58% say the country is worse off than it was 4 years ago. So even though people, 50%, half the country feel personally, financially, they're better off, but they say that 58% of the country is worse off than it was 4 years ago. And again, that leaves the door open for Biden if he can successfully negotiate that. So let's just take a look at some of the polls and some of the statistical information that is important when you're looking at what the election night's going to look like. Right now, in the national polls, and what happens, pollsters in this day and age, what they do is average polls. So there's a website, 538, that I look at every morning. That's a website it's nonpartisan, but they look at all the polls taken by everybody that are credible. Sometimes there's pollsters that are really not credible. They're affiliated with one of the campaigns, but those pollsters that are considered credible, those polls are averaged. And right now, amongst those voters, amongst those polls, Biden has a little better than an 8-point edge. But keep in mind, that's a national poll. And the national poll really, at the end, although it indicates sort of where things are going, we vote by state. And we'll get to that again in a second. But right now, if you look at Trump's approval rating, this has been pretty steady, as has the polls ever since the summer. Trump, actually, for his entire term in office, maybe with the exception of the day he was inaugurated, he's had more people disapproving of his presidency than approving. He has always been in about the low 40s. Right now, as of yesterday, he was at 42.8% approval, 53.4% disapproval. And that's a big issue. Now, 4 years ago, and we'll talk about it again later, both Hillary Clinton and Trump were underwater when it came to approval and disapproval, with both candidates having more people disapproving of them than approving of them. But we'll get back into that a little bit later. But I wanted to take you over to the 4 states, particularly the 3 that I think are going to decide the election. In Michigan, Biden has been ahead since the summer by a consistent 8-point margin. Sometimes it dips to 7.9, sometimes it goes a little higher than 8. Biden in Pennsylvania is closing a little bit. Biden was up by 6 or 7 points last week. It's now at 5.6%. So Biden has been ahead again right along since before the conventions. He's up about 5.6%. Wisconsin, another state that Biden needs to win, he's up by 6.8%. And that's a pretty healthy margin going in. But again, anything can happen. There's a lot of other factors that we'll talk toward the end of the program about what could happen. So then you have Arizona. Arizona is a state that if Biden, say loses Wisconsin, it's a state that looks most likely to support Biden of all the other swing states that we talked about before. again, I suspect many of the red states that are very close today, my guess is most of them are going to wind up in Trump's corner. But let's see. Maybe Biden pulls an upset in Florida, maybe North Carolina. We'll see. But right now, as we sit here a week out from the election, Biden is leading. I'd rather be in Biden's shoes today than be in Trump's. That being said, as we know from 4 years ago, anything can happen. Unforeseen things happen all the time. They can shake up the polls. So most political pollsters, most political professionals on the Democratic and Republican side will never make any outlandish predictions a week out. But basically, at this point, Biden is ahead. So I want to move on to what does the electorate in 2020 look like? Well, when it comes to gender, probably 4 years ago, it was the turnout was 52% women. This time it's running the prediction, and all the different polling shows that about 53% of the total electorate this year will be women. 47% will be men. Now, the next one on race, here's where we see some changes. This is why, America is becoming more diverse. So 4 years ago, if you recall, 70% of the people that voted were white. This time, the predictions are, and all the demographic trends are saying that the white vote is going to go down to about 66%, about 2/3 of the entire vote. Now, this doesn't mean turnout. We'll talk about turnout a little bit later. But of the entire electorate, about 66% will be white. And for the first time, at the highest time ever, back in 2000, the non-white vote, African Americans, Hispanics, Asians, and others, the non-white vote was 25% back in 2000, and it was about 30% in just 4 years ago. It is now at 34%. So the potential breakdown between the races, about 2/3 will be white, 34% will be non-white. Of that, African Americans make up about 12% of the minority population, voting population, and that's about the same as it was. However, the Hispanic numbers are increasing. About 4 years ago, about 11% of the vote was Hispanic. This year, the prediction is going to be about 13%. And also among Asian voters, going back to 2000, just 2% of the vote in 2000 was Asian. 4 years ago, it was 4%. It is now at 5%. And then the others are scattered amongst all the other different nationalities and ethnic groups. So you have women are going to be more women than men are going to be voting this year, and more non-white voters. The minority population is getting bigger. We'll talk about turnout a little bit later. When it comes to age, the main changes are going to be both at the high end and the low end of the spectrum. About 23% of this year's vote will include people from the greatest generation and older baby boomers like myself. And that'll make up about 23% of the vote. So that is up from 4 years ago when it was about 16%. So then if you look at the bottom of the screen for age, Generation Z. Now that Generation Z is simply people who are 18 to 23. They're voting for the first time, but that number is going to provide about 10% of the entire turnout. Again, or 10% of the eligible turnout. We'll talk about the turnout factors later. But the bottom line is Generation Z is growing in numbers, and they're up to 10%. So the rest, baby boomers, 56 to 64, will be about 15%. Generation X, which are people who born between 65 and 80, they're going to be about 25% of the vote. And the millennials, which that number has been going up, that's about steady this year at about 27%. So that's what our electorate's going to look like. One other key factor when you're looking at the demographics of an election, and that is the issue of education. Right now, about 36% of our country that is eligible to vote has a 4-year college degree. 64% have not completed college. We'll get back to that issue later, but there's also a dividing line between the parties in many respects, not in total. It's never all or none. It's always a matter of, degree, 5-10% more of people who have degrees may be voting for Democrats, 10-15% more people without a degree may be voting for Republicans. That has been the trend, but nonetheless, it's a very important demographic to look at when we're considering what's going to happen in an election. So now we're going to go to voter turnout, and this is important. Some of these graphs may be a little confusing, but the results are fairly simple, and that is that in 2012, 67%. 2012, 65% of the vote on this screen were white voters. In other words, white voters, here's the point, the way I should put it. White voters turned out, of the eligible white voters, 65% of white voters turned out. Amongst black voters, and we're talking about the total number of people who are eligible to vote, of those, 60% of black voters turned out. Just the same amongst Hispanics. 4 years ago, about just under 50% turned out and voted. Asians, same thing, around 48%. So with a key issue amongst demographics is obviously not just who's registered to vote, but who actually turns out. And white voters turn out about 5 points more than black voters. Hispanic voters turn out about half, and Asians turn out about half. So if there's a greater number of minorities voting, they can make up for some of the lower percentages by having more of that group eligible to vote. So now I just want to switch over to the left side, turnout figures between male and female voters. And as we can see, when it comes to both male registration and female registration, it runs pretty close. There's a few percentage points more females are registered to vote than males. When it comes to turnout, again, female voters, as we saw in 2016, we had 4% more female turnout than we did male turnout. So, and this year, women are expected to vote in higher numbers. That seems to be the trend, but we'll see. The bottom line is the reason really good prognosticators don't make a lot of predictions is because it's the name of the game is not who's eligible to vote, but who actually votes. And now we'll talk a little bit about that again a little bit later. So now this is probably the most instructive graph you're going to see this morning. I'll tell you why. What I did is went back for demographic groups, looked at what happened in 2016 and what the polls show now. Now, keep in mind, we're talking about polls 1 week out. Polls can change, but pretty much this poll is based on, I think these numbers are based on a poll about 6 days ago, and it's subject to change. But here is the trend. Let's look at men voters. In 2016, again, Clinton lost the men by about 11 points. Right now, in all the polls, Biden is behind Trump by 5 points. So there's a 6-point differential between Clinton's performance and Biden's performance against Trump. So Trump is basically losing ground amongst men voters. Amongst women voters, again, Clinton carried the women's vote 54-13 by 13 points. Right now, amongst women, and this has been pretty well publicized, Biden has a commanding lead. It's 60-34. That's about 26 points more than Trump, which means Hillary won last time by 13. Biden's winning this time by 26. So again, that's a negative 13 percentage points for Trump from 4 years ago. Now amongst white voters, and this is very significant. Among white voters before, that was Trump's strongest demographic 4 years ago. He won by 20 points. He beat Hillary Clinton 57-37. Right now, as of last week, I looked at two different polls. Biden was at 45%, Trump was at 50. So again, that's a 15-point swing, going from being ahead by 20 points 4 years ago, being only up by 5 points now. So that's lost to Trump. In other words, he's going in the wrong direction. Now amongst minority voters, Clinton carried African-American votes by 81%, 89 to 8. This time, Biden's getting actually more votes than Hillary got. He's at 91%. Trump has actually got less votes at 4%. Again, a 6-point differential for Trump. Now, Trump is claiming, if you watched the debate last week, that he's doing very well among African-American voters. That remains to be seen. 4 years ago, when black turnout was down, Hillary still got 89%. Trump only got 8%. So anyways, and again, we're going to come back and discuss that at the end. Among Hispanics, Hillary had a 28-point advantage. Right now, Trump actually picked up a couple votes. Biden's vote among Hispanics is actually down by about 4 points. Trump's is down by about 2, but there's a net plus of 2 percentage point increase among Hispanic voters for Trump. Now we look at senior citizens, and these next 2 categories are very important. Senior votes, again, older voters tend to be more conservative, and 4 years ago, Trump carried seniors 65 and plus 52 to 45, 7-point victory. This time, the latest polling shows Biden actually ahead among senior citizens, 54 to 44, a 10-point advantage for Trump, but overall, a loss of 17 points when you compare his turnout, his performance against Hillary. Another important category, independent voters. 4 years ago, Trump beat Clinton amongst independent voters, a very important category, because that oftentimes in a very close election, independent voters are the tipping point. People who identify as independents. Keep in mind, a lot of people who identify as independents they can be registered Republicans or Democrats, but they may lean that way, but they identify themselves as independents. Amongst those voters, Biden has got a 7-point edge over Trump at this point. Again, we have a week to go, but that's an 11-point swing from independent voters between 2016 and 2020 for Trump. So demographically right now, Biden is looking a lot stronger than Hillary 4 years later. Again, these are just polls. We'll have to see how it holds up. But there does seem to be a trend where Biden is doing better amongst certain demographics than Hillary did. So what I want to now do is just do a little summary of, before we take questions, what are the main differences right now between 2016 and 2020? Where are things right now, and what are the most important points? The first thing I want to do is go into the middle. I put down 6 different bullet points. I want to look at the third. The biggest difference from 4 years ago, although we're still in a close election here, is Trump, the president of the United States, Trump is now the incumbent president of the United States, who must defend a record. Now, keep in mind, challengers always have a little bit of advantage in an election because they don't have, Trump was never in public life. He wasn't in the Senate. He wasn't governor. He wasn't in Congress. So you couldn't attack his voting record. You maybe attack his style, some of his views, but he had no record to attack. And so one of the downsides of being elected, no matter what office you're in, once you go into office, you now have to defend your record. And frankly, up until this year, even though Trump has been very controversial for a lot of reasons from the start, but the economy was doing pretty well until the pandemic hit. And the pandemic now, and certainly since the pandemic, Trump's numbers have gone down. They were low to begin with. He was about 45, 46% early in the year. Now he's down around 42, 43. And that is because 58% of the public feels that Trump has not done all he could to fight the pandemic. And he sort of basically turned it over to the states. We've obviously, the pandemic is not under control. So one of the big factors right now is that Biden has never been president. He was vice president, and certainly Trump can attack him on his record as vice president. But Trump is now vulnerable, particularly when it comes to the coronavirus and also the resulting collapse of the economy. An argument could be made by, certainly Biden is making the argument, if he would have focused and let the scientists in and really focus on the pandemic, the economy would not have collapsed, at least to the extent it did. Because we had to shut down the country, obviously resulting in a lot of hardship for our American citizens, loss of jobs, loss of income, just a whole array of things. So the Trump is now in a position where he has to defend his record. That's I think the number one difference from 4 years ago. However, let me go to point number two. Biden, compared to Hillary's campaign 4 years ago, because we have to compare how he did versus Clinton, basically amongst Democratic elected officials, party leaders, people feel he did a better job of unifying the party going into this election. So let me just digress a little bit and talk about 4 years ago, Hillary Clinton picked a moderate white senator from Virginia, Tim Kaine, who's a good man. He's had a good record. But in many respects, she was criticized after the election for that selection, not because he wasn't a good man, but because it didn't take into account the divisions in the party after the 2016 primaries, where Bernie Sanders people were still very upset. Progressives wanted a more progressive person on the ticket than Tim Kaine, again, a white man from Virginia. So the Biden has done that he's getting a lot of credit for amongst the Democrats is he did a good job of working with Sanders after the nomination fight was over, included Sanders in the discussion on the platform. And also, a lot of Sanders supporters wanted Biden to pick a progressive running mate. So he picked Kamala Harris, a senator, African-American woman from California. And that pick has turned out to be very popular, at least to the Democratic base that has to turn out in 2016. Going back 4 years ago, the Black turnout was down 7 percentage points, particularly in major cities like Detroit, which is Michigan, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and Pennsylvania. The Black turnout could have really been a key factor in Hillary Clinton's losing the election. There's another important point to consider differing from 4 years ago. 4 years ago, there were three well-known major third-party candidates. If you remember Jill Stein, she was a professor from Cornell. She was on the Green Party ticket, which is a left-leaning party, supports all the new green legislation. But she took votes away from Hillary Clinton. And it's funny. I mentioned, I don't know if I mentioned Rachel Bitecofer before, a political scientist, wrote a book about the 2016 campaign and what happened. And besides the African-American turnout in the cities, the other thing that she pointed to was in the three big states that we've talked about today, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, they had a huge number of people vote in those three states on a third-party line. In other words, there was Gary Johnson from the former governor of New Mexico. He was running on the Independent Party. Then there was Evan McMullin from Utah. He was running on, I think it was called the Libertarian Party. And then, of course, Jill Stein. So a lot of people that were unhappy that Hillary, just perhaps with Hillary directly, but more so because the party was not unified going into that election to a stronger degree, a lot of people voted third party. So 3.5 times in an average election, about 1.5% of the people vote for a third-party candidate. In other words, 98. In Wisconsin and Michigan, over 5% of the people voted third-party last time. And in Pennsylvania, it was a little under 5. It was 4.8%. But those were votes that went to Jill Stein for the most part. She got the lion's share. And, a left-leaning woman who most of the time those votes would have gone to Clinton. So this time, Biden has done a better job of uniting the ticket. He has a diverse running mate, African-American woman. The Sanders people are on board, and there's really no serious third-party candidates. Let's go to the top. Biden is 5 to 6 points more favorable over unfavorable, while Trump remains unfavorable. Remember before we looked at Trump's favorable ratings, he was down about 11 points, 52% unfavorable, about 50 or 42% favorable. So it's a net unfavorable of about 10 points. Biden right now is running about 5 or 6 points more favorable than unfavorable, compared to Hillary 4 years ago, who was also about 10 points underwater, more unfavorable than favorable on election day. So Biden is, I guess you might say, he's more likable to a lot of at least Democratic voters. So he's got a little bit of an edge going into the election compared to Hillary 4 years ago. I want to go to the bottom. As we talked about before, this is number 4. The electorate is more diverse. More Democratic-leaning voters are into the electorate than they were 4 years ago. I'm not saying huge numbers, but there are more minority voters, more Hispanics, more Asians, Black voters about the same, and more younger voters than 4 years ago. That the Generation Z voters are going to be more. Generation Z voters are eligible than 4 years ago. So that's a factor. And then turnout. 4 years ago, we had 136, almost 137 million people vote. And already this year, as of this morning, it was close to 60 million people have already voted because of the pandemic and people voting by mail or voting early in their neighborhoods. That's a big number, and we have a week to go. So we may have well over half the number of people who voted last election day who have already voted. And so it looks like we are going to have, most prognosticators are saying we're going to have about 150, 155 million voters. Bigger turnouts in the past have tended to favor Democrats, but not necessarily by any means. You could also have a bigger turnout among rural voters, white voters without college degrees who tend to support Trump. The name of the game is turnout is really everything. And we're going to find out, but right now, every indication is the turnout is going to be much bigger and probably at historic levels. Now, the last factor I want to touch on is 2020 is a turnout campaign versus a persuasion campaign. And what is a persuasion campaign? A persuasion campaign is when the campaign urges people to vote for a candidate. In other words, 4 years ago, Hillary Clinton spent the bulk of her money, her advertising money, trying to persuade people that Donald Trump was not fit to be in office. But because of voter polarization, 90% of Republicans vote Republican, 90% of Democrats vote Democratic. She was basically unsuccessful in persuading a whole lot of people that Trump was not fit for office, at least amongst the people that wanted to vote for Trump or didn't want to vote for Hillary. So the persuasion campaign is aimed at trying to get the voter to support one candidate over the other. A turnout election is entirely different, and it's more conducive to the polarization and the negative partisanship that we're experiencing. And that is that both candidates this year are focused on turning out their base. That's why Biden picked Kamala Harris to be on the ticket. They've got a bigger turnout among minority voters, among women voters. He's playing right to the people. So in other words, a campaign is aimed at the voter. It's not aimed at the candidates. It's aimed at identifying people who are definitely for one candidate or the other, and then mobilize them in the vote on election day, turning them out in as great as numbers as possible. So this year's campaign is a turnout campaign by both sides. Trump is playing to his base. He's played to his base the entire 4 years. He's hoping that a bigger percentage of that base turns out on election day than 4 years ago. Biden, the same thing. He's hoping that the more diverse electorate, the bigger electorate, he's trying to turn those voters out based on where he thinks, how he thinks they're going to vote. So there's in some respects from 4 years ago, the campaign's the same, but in many respects, it's still divisive, it's still polarized, there's still a lot of negative partisanship. But the bottom line is there are differences. And the biggest one is Trump is now the incumbent and Biden is not. The Democrats, even though 4 years ago Hillary was running, there was no incumbent. Basically, most people looked at her as running as a third Obama term, and Trump is the change candidate. And that's not what's happening this year. So anyways, I think I've talked long enough. I don't know what time it is, but I'd like to open up to questions or comments. Katie, I'll turn that over to you. What are we doing?
All right, Len, yeah, we have time for questions and comments. So thank you so much for giving us that talk. I'm seeing a couple questions here. The first one I'm seeing is, how can we believe these polls when they were so wrong last time?
Okay, so the question is, how can we believe the polls when they were wrong last time? Okay, that's a good question. And the answer to that is, I think, because they were, no, let's take a look at 4 years ago. They weren't really that far off. I mean, keep in mind, going into the weekend of the election, Hillary Clinton was up by about 3 points, 3.5 points. That was within the margin of error. We know what the term margin of error is. Even pollsters say, give me a little slack here. But Hillary wound up winning the popular vote in 2016 by 2 points. She won that election by almost 3 million votes. What she did was she lost the Electoral College, particularly because of Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. So what the pollsters have done this time is they have basically focused on averaging the polls as opposed to, like, I meet the press before every election, the Sunday before an election, you'll see a pollster come out and say that Hillary's up by 3, Biden's up by 4, whatever. What you're going to have this time is most of the pollsters are participating in the averaging of the polls. When you see a poll, to put it in perspective, it gives you, it includes more polling to give it more credibility. Like, for instance, the polling has been very stable since the summer. It really hasn't changed. Now it's ticking a little bit. Closer you get to any election, things tighten up a little bit. But basically, the polls are pretty much the same. So I just think, yes, the pollsters, the people who made predictions were wrong. The polling was a little off, but it wasn't off that much. But keep in mind, Biden won that election by 77,000 votes for covering 3 states out of 136 million votes. So yes, it was a shock, but the polls were that far off.
Thanks, Len. Sticking with polls, the next question, who are the people polled? I and many others no longer have landlines and don't answer if it's an unknown number. Are polls done by phone? Yes, a lot of,
that's a very good question, by the way. Historically, obviously, people call on landlines, but pollsters do have ways of getting cell phones. You can purchase those lists. So I think what you have is, there's no doubt that pollsters still try to rely on landlines, but they do call people on cell phones as well.
Okay, thank you. Next question, are the electorate numbers based on voter registration or entire population?
Katie, just repeat that again. It's between registration and affiliation.
Are the electorate numbers based on voter registration or the entire population?
Oh, the electoral numbers are based on registration. In other words, we have about, in this country, 35 million registered voters. Last election, we had about 137 million voters. It was about 57%. This year, I think the number is going to be higher. I think we're going to be over 60%. We may get to 65%. But people, when polling is done, it's done amongst registered voters. And keep in mind, there's also a difference between people who are registered to vote and people who are more likely to vote. And right now, the pollsters are drilling in on people who are most likely to vote. Keep in mind, 4 years ago, over 100 million people didn't vote. So pollsters tend to call voters who have a history of turning out of the polls.
Okay, thanks, Len. Next comment, if Trump wins, I believe it's because of his frantic campaigning in the final weeks versus Biden's prevent defense approach. This will spur turnout.
Okay, so if the question is, the comment, the voter said, if Trump wins, it's because of his campaigning in the last couple of weeks?
Yes, basically.
Well, there's no doubt that 4 years ago, Trump really did win the election in the last week. And Clinton was criticized a little bit for not going into Michigan and Wisconsin. I'm not sure she got into Wisconsin at all. I think she got in Michigan once. Of course, she was in Pennsylvania quite a few times. But there's no doubt that Trump is who was considered the underdog. He went into fewer states in the last 10 days of the campaign 4 years ago, where Hillary Clinton was still trying to expand the map. She was trying to win Arizona. She was trying to win North Carolina. She was trying to win Florida. And most polls down toward the end really make it clear what are the really close states. Keep in mind, there's polls that we see as the public, then there's internal polls that the candidates have. And Trump's polling obviously showed that Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin were up for grabs, or at least getting very close. And then again, voter turnout plays a huge, on paper, Clinton probably was ahead, but her turnout was down because there wasn't a lot of unity in the party. The Sanders people were mad. African Americans, they no longer had Obama on the ticket. Their turnout was down 7%. And then all the people had voted in third party, sort of what we call protest ballots. So.
Thank you. The next thing I'm seeing is so many of the principals in politics these days are in their 70s and 80s. I have nothing against people living long, productive lives, but is this going to be a long-term trend, or is this just an odd moment in time?
I have to say that this is a moment in time. But keep in mind, people, if you look at the U.S. Senate, probably the average age of the Senate is probably close to 70. The House a little bit younger. But I think Biden really wanted, when we look at the two candidates, Trump obviously was 70 years old when he got elected. He's now 74. And Biden really wanted to run the last time. He, he lost his son, died just a year before the election. He is most incumbent vice presidents wind up running when the president's term runs out. So Biden didn't get that opportunity. But to me, the main factor in Biden being the candidate is sort of simple. Part of it is Trump. The Democrats, for the first time in a long time, said the most important issue in this campaign is who can best defeat Donald Trump and get him out of there. And even though there were, what would he have, 18 candidates at first when the Democratic primaries started, most people looked at and said, who is most likely to attract votes in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan? Keep in mind, Biden, when he was vice president, helped save the auto industry. Remember when the auto industry collapsed? You probably don't, Katie, but when it did happen, Biden led the Obama's administration plan to revitalize the auto industry. And that's big stuff in Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania. Also, Biden was born in Scranton, Pennsylvania. He identifies, and even Delaware is close to Philadelphia. It's almost considered a suburb of Philadelphia. So Biden in Pennsylvania, I think Pennsylvania is the tipping point in this election. I would say whoever wins Pennsylvania is probably going to win this election. That being said, Biden has a lot more paths to victory than Trump does, because so many of the Trump states from 4 years ago, I know I'm getting off the question a little bit, but again, as we conclude this program, we should remember that Biden has all the states that Hillary had 4 years ago in his corner. He just has to convert. He needs to get 46 electoral votes from somewhere, or 42, 40. The best place to get those, most likely chance for those coming is Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. Trump, on the other hand, has to defend his territory. He's not ahead in Florida. He's not ahead in North Carolina, although he was a little behind last time. He managed to win those by just a hair. But Georgia, he won Georgia last time by 5 points. Georgia is dead even as we speak. But again, I wouldn't take that to the bank if I was a Democrat. Arizona, I think Arizona is the state that's most likely to flip from red to blue because of the diversity of that state, Hispanic turnout. And then of course, but again, going back to Florida, if Biden wins Florida in a close vote, and the advantage of Florida is we're going to know how Florida turns out on election night. Some of these other states we're going to have to wait 3 or 4 days, maybe even a couple of weeks for. So anyways, go ahead.
Thank you, Len, for that. Next question I'm seeing is, do you think the Electoral College is appropriate today, or should we elect a president with the popular vote?
Is the question, do I think the electoral vote is still is a fair way to determine the president, or should go?
Is it's still appropriate today. Mm-hmm.
I'll be honest with you, I don't. I think the Electoral College was conceived, way back when our founders were writing the Constitution, and it was really based on making sure different parts of the country were represented. You got to keep in mind, in the last 7 presidential elections, the Republicans have not been able to get a majority vote over 50%. Bush in 2004 did go over 50%, but in 2 out of the last 5 elections, the candidate who had the most votes did not win. And I think now, in a more more contemporary, more modern day functioning of our country, I think my feeling is the person with the most votes should win, and that would prevent so much of the angst, so much of the frustration with having a candidate in office who didn't win the popular vote but is governing the country. So I personally favor going to a new model, and there are a couple models out there, but we won't get into all that right now.
Well, our next question is a follow-up. So can the electoral vote be changed so it's not winner take all? I guess what would that look like if it were to change? Well,
it can, but it would take a constitutional change, which would require 3/4 of the Congress, or 3/4 of the states to approve it. So there are some other models out there. Tom Golisano has a thing called the national popular vote, where state legislatures would agree that whoever won their state by the popular vote, they would award them the electoral votes. But that's a long way from happening. But I do think you're going to see, as years go on, more efforts to have a popular vote as opposed to the Electoral College. But I don't think it's going to be in my lifetime.
Thank you, Len. I'm not seeing any other questions. Len, if I don't know if you have your Q&A panel up, if you just want to do a quick scan, make sure we're not missing anybody.
Yeah, I don't see anything on mine.
Okay.
Let me just say to everybody, thanks so much for participating today. The most important thing I can say to you as a fellow American is the vote. Again, we're not here to, at least for this program, to advocate for any of the candidates. I certainly am a partisan myself, but it is important that we vote. And so we've got many opportunities we can do it. We can do it in person, early voting, do it by mail, or we can do it in person the day of the election. But I hope everybody does turn out to vote, and that hopefully the polarization in our country at some point will tamper down. I don't know if it'll be anytime soon, but I do think the most important thing is that our country get unified, and that we really have a shared sense of purpose about what we want as Americans. What are the values of this country? What do we want to exemplify in values as we deal with the rest of the world and with our own people? So thank you, everybody, for calling in today and participating. And I hope I helped you somewhat understand the crazy mechanics of politics in this day and age.
Len, thank you so much. I'm seeing one final comment here. Excellent presentation. Thank you. Very informative, which I'll echo that. We appreciate your time. And for everybody who's on, thank you. And I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day.
Good. Happy election week. Enjoy.